Good day, generals, and welcome to new episode of Men Around the Führer. The story we unravel today is not one of a hero, nor even a conventional villain, but of a man who sought to be both simultaneously. A lawyer who became the chief agent of lawlessness, a cultivated intellectual who embraced barbarity, and a man obsessed with writing himself into history, only to ensure his own condemnation. This is the chronicle of Hans Michael Frank. Born on May 23, 1900 in Karlsruhe, Germany, Hans Frank came into a world ripe for turmoil. His family moved to Munich a year later, anchoring him in Bavaria, though his childhood was far from stable. He was a middle-class boy, but his home life was complicated. His father, also a lawyer, was characterized by some accounts as deceitful, a weakling, and a womanizer, eventually being struck off the legal register for embezzlement and experiencing a spell in prison. Hans's mother left home to live with a German professor in Czechoslovakia, meaning the young Hans shuttled between parents during his teenage years. Frank's private diary, kept between 1918 and 1919, reveals a cultured but aimless, self-absorbed young intellectual. He thrilled to cultural life, attending concerts and finding solace in nature, even declaring that Shakespeare must have been German. This was a mind submerging itself in a romantic tide, demonstrating the pretentiousness and self-importance that would define his life. Yet, he also lived through the bitter end of the Great War and the chaos that followed, mourning the German nation's defeat deeply and finding national pride inseparable from his romantic feelings. In the immediate post-war turbulence of Munich, Frank found his first political stirrings. Surprisingly, when the socialist leader Kurt Eisner was assassinated, Frank mourned him as an idealist and a champion of truth, a hero who had died for his ideals. This respect for a political figure, regardless of ideology, set a pattern. He respected the charisma and leadership first, and later sought to accommodate himself to their ideas. Frank soon transitioned from a cultural dilettante to a political activist. He was drawn into the Thule Society, an organization of jingoistic malcontents. Through them, he came into contact with the German Workers' Party, which later became the Nazi Party. Frank joined this party and later even claimed credit for helping leaders like Feder and Drexler devise its political program. He heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time in January 1920, and the experience left an indelible mark. Hitler, though of average stature and wearing a worn-out old blue suit, spoke with a loud, clear, passionate voice, managing to blend common experiences with profound political principles. Frank felt he was witnessing a terrific spirit of the age and sensed a genuine and electric contact between the leader and his subjects. Education, however, continued alongside this political radicalization. Frank studied law, philosophy, and economics in Munich, Kiel, and Vienna, earning a doctorate in law from Kiel in 1924, the same year as the failed beer hall putsch. Frank's entry into the national movement was secured through his professional services. He was the movement's lawyer. He represented Hitler and the party in over 2,400 cases, earning him the nickname the defense lawyer of the National Socialist movement. He defended members of the party in court, introducing paramilitary values and an aggressive parasitism on the Weimar legal system. For instance, during the trial of the Ulm officers in 1930, Frank managed to turn the defense into an attack on the Weimar Republic, portraying the government's agents as corrupt, and arguing that soldiers should put the fatherland above the Constitution when the latter fell into the hands of betrayers. Hitler's own testimony during that trial pledged to pursue power only through legal means, an assertion the judges accepted, vindicating Hitler and his movement in front of the whole nation. Frank's participation in this legal coup provided significant momentum to the party. Hans Frank's burgeoning career was complicated by his adoption of anti-Jewish hatred. He showed signs that anti-Semitism did not come naturally. In his early diaries, Jews were only mentioned briefly as the founders of monotheism, and he did not initially label socialism or Bolshevism as Jewish. However, immersed in the Nazi milieu, he accepted and developed it whenever the opportunity arose. In a 1931 speech to university students, he questioned why Jews, only 1% of the population, constituted 50% of university teachers, closing with a flaming appeal against the usurpation of Germanic thought by Jewish Marxist materialism. By the end of this period, he was articulating that law had to be liberated from every foreign racial influence, explicitly labeling certain legal ideas as a Jewish jurisprudence of decadence. When the Nazis seized power, Frank's loyalty was rewarded, though perhaps not as highly as he desired. In March 1933, he was appointed Commissarial Justice Minister in Bavaria, later gaining the full title. He also became a Reich minister without portfolio, and established and became president of the Academy for German Law in June 1933. His task was to revolutionize and coordinate the nation's lawyers behind National Socialism. Frank sought to define a legal theory appropriate for the new regime, stripping National Socialist perspectives down to their bare bones and proclaiming them loudly. His core idea, often summarized as everything which is of use to the nation is just right, whatever damages it is unjust, wrong, meant that law was expected to serve the nation and protect its vital racial substance. He openly posited a totalitarian state revolving around the leader, but rooted in the commonly held racist values of the German nation, arguing that racial crossbreeding produced internal confusion about ideas of justice. He saw his ideology as a racial theory of revolution opposing Marxism's class conflict. Yet, even in the new regime, Frank quickly found himself clashing with the brutal reality of extrajudicial violence, a tension that plagued his professional life. While Bavarian Justice Minister, reports reached him concerning atrocities committed by the stormtroopers, SA, and the SS against party opponents. He raised the issue vigorously, even notifying high-ranking officials like Rudolf Hess and Martin Bormann about cases like the torture and death of suspected communist Oskar Pflaume. Most famously, Frank protested the unlawful killings at the Dachau concentration camp. His objections, expressed at a time of arbitrary violence, focused on the murders weakening the power of the legal system. He insisted that arresting and killing people without trial was intolerable. Although the investigation into Dachau was eventually quashed in November 1933 on the grounds that continuing it would be against the interests of the state, Frank continued to pursue the issue. A more profound clash occurred during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler liquidated the leadership of the SA. Frank was privy to details of Hitler's actions during this purge. Frank objected to the extrajudicial killings. When later interrogated, he stated that he had been in police surveillance for several days in Munich and relieved of all his party offices after speaking out for the immortal rule of law and arguing that a Reich without law and humanity could not last long. He never risked his own life during these struggles, choosing compromise instead of outright resistance. The conflicts were enough to make him the wrong sort of Nazi in the eyes of the ruthless elements. Despite these internal struggles, Frank remained fundamentally loyal to Hitler, praising the leader as someone sent by God. Even in January 1939, following the Crystal Night pogroms, Frank sent Hitler a telegram affirming, "My life is and remains service to your work. Heil to you, my leader." Frank was a lawyer in an essentially lawless state, clinging to the intoxicating atmosphere of importance and power that the senior echelons of government offered. Frank's life reached its most infamous peak when, in October 1939, Hitler appointed him Governor-General of German-occupied Poland, the territory known as the general government, was to be an administrative region distinct from the parts of Poland incorporated directly into the German Reich. Frank entered a political vacuum. He had no knowledge of Polish, no specialist contacts, and no particular expertise in the country. The post was a fresh start for a marginalized figure and an opportunity for the self-important lawyer to put a personal stamp on the empire. Hitler's instructions, given to Frank in his special train, were succinct and brutal. The devastated territory had to be put into order and exploited ruthlessly to contribute to the German Reich's difficult economic and war situation. Critically, the Polish population had to be deprived of any leadership caste capable of providing enduring opposition. They were to be denationed entirely and left as mere economic units. Frank's territory was to be the first colonial territory of the German nation and a gateway to a world empire, a place where he could realize his legalistic ideals and construct an orderly state structure from scratch. Frank immediately embraced this mission, setting up his headquarters in Wawel Castle in Krakow. He adopted a grandiose, theatrical persona, surrounding himself with luxury, fine arts, and bohemian glass, contrasting sharply with the misery he imposed on the population. Hans Frank saw himself as a manager and technocrat, driven by the Nazi concept of achievement. He emphasized speed, simplicity, and structural clarity in his administration. He initiated steps to create systems appropriate for a multiracial new order, allowing a restricted form of self-administration for Poles and Ukrainians, but always framed within the hierarchy where Germans stood at the head, presiding over inferior foreign specimens. He made efforts to address the terrible economic situation and labor issues, noting that annihilation was not always compatible with productivity, famously pointing out that authorities wanted both productivity and asset stripping, but you could not kill the cow you were trying to milk. However, the foundation of this new empire was terror. Frank accepted the agenda of liquidating the Polish leadership layer. On May 30, 1940, at a meeting dedicated to police matters, Frank admitted that several thousand Poles, especially from the spiritual and intellectual leadership, would pay with their lives. He declared that the administration needed to put an end already to the mob of seditionist politicians of resistance. He justified this by saying that those who carried out executions were not murderers at all, but executors of a sentence established by the law of the German nation, bringing into existence the law of the German nation. In this perversion of law, the executioners were to be pitied, not the victims. Frank used virulently harsh propaganda to break the moral restraints of his staff. He joked that if posters were put up in his territory every time 7 Poles were shot, as was done in Bohemia and Moravia, soon there would be no trees left. He publicly grouped Jews, lice, and vermin together, calling Jews parasites who wallowed in dirt. This language, which helped create a consensus for annihilation, served to dehumanize the victims and corrode the moral instincts of his administrators, making desk-bound crime function. By 1941, Frank was deeply entrenched in the exterminatory goals of the Third Reich, and he had a clear sense of what was coming. At a cabinet session in Krakow on December 16, 1941, Frank delivered a closing address where he spoke of the final solution. He was brazenly clear that Jews had to vanish completely. Frank explicitly facilitated mass murder, even attempting to carve out a personal stake in the project. Faced with Himmler's plan to resettle Europe's Jews to Madagascar, Frank tried to offer a more profitable alternative that would benefit the general government. He proposed sending the general government's Jews to the Pripyat region, an area notorious for its harsh environment. This was an opportunistic and cynical idea, recommending that Jews be sent to a murderous place where they would be worked to death, with their achievements left behind for German benefit. He was perfectly prepared to cross the border between talk and action, advocating for biological genocide through slave labor. In his speeches, He often reflected the priorities given to him by Hitler. The leader had promised him that the general government would be the first part of the German sphere of power to be cleared of Jews. Frank reported that in time, his territory was to lose entirely its Jewish and Polish character, with Jews and Poles removed in 15 to 20 years. Frank's ambition and drive for exclusive authority in the general government brought him into constant escalating conflict with the SS and police authorities, particularly SS General Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, the higher SS and police leader East. Krüger consistently eroded Frank's authority, often acting on direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, who was establishing his own independent security secretariat. Frank saw Krüger as threatening his self-ascribed role as Hitler's managerial technocrat. The conflict sharpened over major policies. Krüger and Himmler's Zamość resettlement action in 1942, intended to clear Poles and settle ethnic Germans, was carried out over Frank's head. Frank, initially cut out of the policy loop, later fought back using the chaos of the Zamość experiment as leverage, complaining directly to Hitler in 1943 that the arbitrary actions of Himmler's representatives were damaging the standing of the Reich and harming agricultural productivity. Frank continued to complain about the extermination policy because it divested him of valuable labor power. In December 1942, he noted that annihilating Jews working in German interests would not help the war effort and asked the Reich government to rescind such orders. By July 1943, he noted that the Jewish population had plummeted from 3.5 million to just 203,000, acknowledging that millions had vanished, with only one possible explanation for what was going on. In the summer of 1942, faced with the escalating crisis of his authority, the execution of his friend Dr. Karl Lasch on embezzlement charges, and police investigation of his own family for corruption, Frank embarked on a dramatic political maneuver. He undertook a lecture tour across German universities in Berlin, Vienna, Munich, and Heidelberg to denounce his internal rivals and argue for a different type of Nazi state. This campaign was rooted in his long-standing legal idealism and his frustration with the SS. He spoke to educated elites, academics, and lawyers, raising points that went to the heart of National Socialism. Frank argued passionately for the independence of the judiciary, saying that an authoritarian state system should not be at odds with the preservation of courts controlled by neither police nor politicians. In Munich, he declared that judges and lawyers were still better than any kind of police state, a comment met with stormy applause. In Heidelberg, he rejected the police state completely, insisting that Europe will be humane and that it was unnecessary always and constantly to use the death penalty. He demanded that Germany be run through strength, not brutality. Hitler was overcome with fury by these speeches. Frank was immediately stripped of all his party honors and legal offices, being replaced as leader of the German legal system by Otto Thierack. However, Hitler did not accept Frank's subsequent resignation as governor-general. Frank remained in Krakow, presiding over what became an empire of shadows, even as the war turned against Germany. As German defeat became inevitable, Frank shifted his policy proposals, advocating for a pragmatic utilitarianism and arguing that terror had failed. He proposed giving greater cultural freedom to Poles, even suggesting a Chopin celebration in Galicia and the use of Polish-language newspapers. As late as July 1944, he wrote to SS General Ernst Kaltenbrunner, warning that severe measures would generate a revolt and recommending radical moderation, including the recognition of Polish nationhood, schools, and universities. Frank was not advocating true morality, but arguing that extermination and oppression were counterproductive. You could not kill the cow you were trying to milk. Frank's administration officially ended on January 19, 1945. As the Soviets advanced, Frank fled, eventually arriving in Bavaria. He attempted to maintain the trappings of power, but was effectively powerless. In May 1945, he was arrested by U.S. Army soldiers near Berchtesgaden. Hans Frank was taken to a holding center for senior Nazis, where he was described as a pitiful wreck of a man. He, along with his fellow captives, was subjected to psychological shock therapy, notably by being shown a film about the Buchenwald camp. Frank gagged and held a handkerchief to his mouth for 15 minutes after viewing the atrocities. During his captivity, Frank voluntarily surrendered 43 volumes of his personal diaries to the Allies, believing his struggles against other Nazi officials would be enough to secure his defense. The irony was immense. This diary, filled with exhortations to murder and detailed records of exploitation, was used against him as evidence of his guilt. The Polish delegation to the International Tribunal, led by Stanisław Piotrowski, abstracted the diary, turning it into material evidence. One analyst remarked that Frank essentially plaited his own noose. Frank underwent a spiritual crisis, expressing profound mental turmoil. He converted to Catholicism during his imprisonment and was rebaptized in his cell in October 1945. He told the prison chaplain that he felt he was a man who had sold his soul only to repurchase it at the cost of his life. Frank admitted guilt, though only partially, and testified hysterically that 1,000 years will pass, and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased. During his trial at the Nuremberg Military Tribunal, Frank was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity on October 1, 1946. He was unique among the major defendants, along with Albert Speer, in showing any degree of remorse. However, his repentance was often viewed with skepticism, colored by self-importance and evasion. When asked if he had promoted the existence of extermination camps, Frank answered affirmatively, but with the caveat that he himself had never installed one. He confessed to the charges, but sought to deflect responsibility onto Hitler and the German people as a whole, claiming the incriminating diary phrases were typical of a wild and stormy period. While awaiting execution, Frank wrote his memoirs, In the Face of the Gallows. In this work, he tried to revise his past, characterizing the period before 1939 conventionally and arguing that the war and the Holocaust were Hitler's fault alone, pursued under conditions of such secrecy that the details only became apparent at Nuremberg. The memoirs contained a sensational, unsubstantiated claim that Hitler had commissioned him in 1930 to investigate rumors that Hitler's father, Alois, was the illegitimate son of a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger. Scholars widely dismiss this Frankenberger hypothesis. Some suggest Frank fabricated this story out of cunning, seeking revenge on Hitler by foisting a sordid explanation of his lineage onto him for all posterity. Frank also used the memoir to characterize the Nazi movement as an artificial structure of slogans which only unburdened party members of their old ethical and religious limitations, anticipating later functionalist interpretations of Nazism. Frank was sentenced to death by hanging. His execution, carried out by U.S. Army Master Sergeant John C. Woods, took place on October 16, 1946, at Nuremberg Prison. As he approached the scaffold, Frank thanked the governor for the kind treatment he had received during incarceration and prayed, "I pray God to receive me mercifully," followed by Jesus, mercy. Hans Frank left behind a complex and tragic legacy, particularly for his children. His son, Nicholas Frank, became a journalist who openly despised his father, depicting him in his memoir, In the Shadow of the Reich, 1991, as a craven coward and weakling and a slimehole of a Hitler fanatic. Nicholas chronicled his father's extensive corruption, describing bizarre images of his mother accumulating furs in the ghetto, and his father sending trainloads of eggs back to Germany for personal disposal. Nicholas felt that his siblings' brains had been poisoned by their father. who often portrayed himself as a man of the law rather than acknowledging personal guilt. Hans Frank's life, from the self-absorbed young man dreaming of Germanic ideals to the colonial despot surrounded by looted art and burdened by millions of deaths, illustrates the vanity of evil. He was not a passive cog in a machine, but an ambitious lawyer whose desire for intellectual prestige, wealth, and historical importance led him to compromise every principle he claimed to hold, providing the ideological and administrative framework necessary for the Third Reich's most catastrophic crimes. His existence serves as a testament to how an educated professional man seeking to define a great destiny for himself could be seduced by power and end up drowning in the blood he helped spill.